Welcome to Business Line's State of the Economy podcast, where you'll find insight, analysis, and the story behind the numbers.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Hindu Business Line's State of the Economy podcast. Today we have with us Mr. Prashanth Nutula, partner at Deloitte India. Prashanth has almost 2 decades of combined consulting and industry experience in oil and gas, consumer, industrial, and manufacturing sectors. He has delivered several projects in strategy and business plan preparation, policy conception, transaction advisory, market assessment, location assessment, cost reduction, large EBITDA improvement engagements, and program management. Our chat today with Prashanth is on the sustainable aviation fuel and what are the growth prospects for this biofuel in India. Recently, Deloitte India came out with a report on the sustainable aviation fuel, and it says that India can produce about 8 to 10 million tons annually by financial year 2039-2040, for which investments worth roughly 6 to 7 lakh crores or around $70 to $85 billion would be required. Besides, there are prospects for India turning into a leading sustainable aviation fuel exporter, as the report indicates that the 8 to 10 million ton production would surpass India's estimated domestic demand, which is roughly around 4.5 million tons, for a 15% blending mandate in 2040 across all flights. And besides, SAF production, since it's a biofuel, Deloitte says that it can boost farmers' income by 10 to 15%, something which will make the government really happy, using agriculture residue as feedstock. And now, Prashanth comes in where Prashanth will take us down. Prashanth has deep insights into the sustainable aviation fuel trajectory here and break us to the various aspects and the dynamics and the impact of this that will have on the aviation sector. So welcome, Prashanth. Great to have you on Business Line State of Economy podcast.
Thank you, Rishi, for having me here. Happy to be here, and thank you for all the podcast viewers as well. Happy to be here, and Rishi, let's discuss this.
Yeah, so I think, Prashanth, you're clued into sustainable fuel is the latest in biofuels and decarbonization that we are seeing. We'll begin small. Well, if you could explain to our listeners, what is sustainable aviation fuel and, why has it become so important?
Sure, Rishi. So, when we look at aviation fuel, right, which drives our aircraft, etc., like any other industry, decarbonization of aviation sector also is an important fact, right? Today, aviation in India probably, contributes about 3% or less than 5% of transport emissions. But as the industry is growing, we expect, both the passenger as well as freight market is expected to grow 11 to 13% over the next 6-7 years. By 2030 itself, aviation sector's contribution to emissions and transportation will be anywhere 8 to 10%, right? So therefore, it's an important thing to decarbonize. And when we look at different solutions to decarbonize the aviation sector, sustainable aviation fuel becomes an important one, right? And what is sustainable aviation fuel? Is fuel which is, produced from renewable sources such as, used cooking oil, agri waste, municipal waste, or, renewable energy, and so on. So it is produced from green sources, and therefore it's called sustainable aviation fuel, right? And therefore, what it can do, it can reduce emissions up to almost 80% over life cycle of the fuel, depending on the pathway, depending on the feedstock which is being used. Right? Why is it important today? Right? Now, number one reason it needs to decarbonize, but why is it today? There is a CORSIA mandate. Now, when you look at emissions, typically your domestic flight emissions come under what is called as nationally determined contributions, where a government of a particular country is responsible and driving those emission mandates, etc. But for international flights, where flight is originating in country and going to another country and some other countries, in those airspaces, it's difficult for one government to dictate what should be the targets, etc. So therefore, IATA's CORSIA mandate, CORSIA is Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation, has determined a mandate for across all the international airlines. It has come in, currently it's in voluntary phase. It started with in 2021 as pilot phase. 21 to 23 was pilot. First phase was 24 to 26, which is ongoing, but mandatory phase starting from 2027. India has taken a mandatory. We are not part of the voluntary phases, but we are part of the mandatory phase. What does it say? 2019, it has taken as a baseline year. If emissions are for a particular airline, it's say, for example, we take 100 tons in that, 100 tons CO2 in that year, 85% of that 2019 emissions becomes the baseline. Now, any airline post that has to, offset emissions over and beyond what is the 2019 85% baseline. So that becomes an important factor for airlines flying international routes, right? Second, IATA has member bodies or member airlines of IATA and has committed to taking 2050 as net zero, right? So therefore, starting mandatory phase of 2027 and therefore even up to 2050, between them, airlines have to decarbonize the sector, right? So therefore, this is important. Now we are sitting in 2024, 2027 onwards for Indian airlines, it becomes an important route to start decarbonizing. Right? So those are the two important factors why it is now and what it is sustainable aviation fuel.
So, a brilliant breakdown into it. Now, Prashant, you are sort of a bridge between the government and the industry, essentially the policy makers and the sector which will implement those policies or follow those policies. Wanted to, get your insights into, how is the government looking at this sustainable aviation fuel initiative? I know there are this compressed biogas, ethanol blending, others are also happening. But sustainable aviation fuel is more specialized considering that the aviation sector is important and is strategic. How is the government, looking at it? And what perspectives do you get from the industry? Basically, when you interact with both the government and the industry, what is the sense that you are getting?
So, government for international, as I said, 2027 onwards, it's for applicable for international airlines, the CORSIA mandate. Mm-hmm. As of now, Government of India has said as indicative blending mandate of SAF, 1% in 2027 and 2% in 2028. Right? That gives obviously the direction for airlines flying international routes to start looking at SAF blending from 27 and 28 as the numbers, right? Now, what needs to be done? So this is an initial point which government or India has taken it, right? Now, obviously, we need a couple of things we would probably require. One, a clear long-term roadmap and blending mandates. Like we have seen in ethanol case, right? Ethanol blending program. Government has mandated certain blending mandates. Now we are close to as a 20% target, which you have seen, right? So therefore, that becomes similar to that in SAF, while we have for the 27 and 28 years. We would probably require a clear roadmap India should have till 2030. I mean, clearly saying what should be the number in 30, 35, 40, right? What it would do is give directions to investors, etc. On that front, what kind of investments are required, what kind of feedstock they can look at, with investment should come in, both for traditional oil and gas players who supply aviation fuel or new investors who would look at this as a growing sector, and of course airlines and probably also airports to a certain extent, right? So it will give all of them a clear roadmap to say this is something which we need to look into it, right? That I think that would help as number one, having a clear roadmap. Right? Second, in terms of encouraging the sector, right? We have seen India having PLI schemes, we have seen investments coming in some form of indicator or trigger to say whether it's in the form of PLI or in any form of incentives to encourage investments, giving a directional one on saying what kind of production we can see from different blending mandates, and therefore what kind of investments and subsequent to that what kind of incentives can be taken. So these two things are paramount to say to drive the investments and the opportunity taking shape and form, right? Also, we would require a certain kind of what it will do, as you started at the start saying, it will give benefits to different stakeholders across the value chain, right? Most of the feedstock is coming from rural areas, whether it's agri residue and so on. It will definitely benefit farmers. It will add income to the farmers. It's a agri waste. We are not, most of it is agri waste, residual. We are seeing some form of stubble burning, and therefore we see every year in the winter months in some form and shape disrupting the economy, and we are seeing a lot of environmental challenges. It will address some part of it. It will give additional income to the farmers, and it will bring investments in rural and semi-urban areas, right? Because we need to set up logistics, infrastructure, collection, etc. It will generate also job generation. So it has multiple downstream benefits beyond what we are looking primarily from decarbonizing the aviation sector. And obviously, we are an import-dependent country. Part of imports can be replaced by the SAF. It also helps in terms of energy security to that extent as well.
So you've very widely covered a lot of things in this. Prashanth, if we look at the feedstock, I know you've just described the feedstocks. For instance, just wanted to give you an example about the ethanol blending. So now the government is looking at maize crop and they are looking at sweet sorghum. Trials are going on for sweet sorghum. So I am assuming that we can use these similar products can be used for sustainable aviation fuel as well. So just for my benefit, is there a difference between ethanol and sustainable aviation fuel in terms of chemical composition or others?
Okay. When we look at ethanol, it's an alcohol. You still need to convert into aviation fuel, which is jet fuel or kerosene, right? So there is a process, there is an investment which needs to be done. There's a process of converting ethanol to sustainable aviation fuel. Aviation fuel is similar in properties, or SAF is similar in properties to the existing jet fuel, which is kerosene in nature, right? Chemically, right? So therefore, there is an investment, there is a capex required, and there is certain processes which will convert ethanol to SAF, right? It's not a direct blending like you're doing in petrol, right? You still need to convert ethanol to SAF.
Right. My next question was basically on the estimated requirement for blending targets.
Right.
So basically, right now we are at 1% and 2% for 27 next year. So roughly, how much will be required? And I know it's a very difficult question, but India has agriculture resources, but we also have a huge population. So keeping in mind the dynamics of the farm sector, what would be the quantum of requirement? Because essentially we'll at some point escalate it to 5%. That is what the understanding that we had from the government is that slowly they'll ramp it up to at least 5%. So what is the kind of production that we're estimated requirement that we are looking at?
Okay, so let me break it down like in terms of what is the domestic and what is international, right? So today we consume as India about 8.2 million tons of aviation fuel, right? And when we look at say 27 and 28, this is primarily international flights, right? And international is about approximately 25% of that 8.2 million ton, right? And when we grow at 10, 11%, etc., our estimate is FY28 at 2% blending for international flight. It's about 0.06 million tons or 60,000 tons of sustainable aviation fuel required. Right? But if I take maybe future projections of 30 and 40, with the aviation sector growing, our estimate is FY24 to FY30, probably India would be anywhere between 15 to 16 million tons of aviation fuel required, right? If we assume a 5% blending, right, for both domestic and international in FY30, our requirement will be close to 0.8 million tons, right? And if I take a 2040 projection as well, right, where potentially India would require at this growth rates 30 to 31 million tons of aviation fuel. And if we assume a 15% blending, if you are in 30 at 5%, we assume a certain higher blending rate. If you assume a 15%, it's close to 4.5 million tons, right? So starting at 28, only international probably will require about 60,000 tons. at 5%. For both domestic and international in 30 would be about 0.8, and potentially FY40 at 15% blending mandates would be close to 4.5 million tons. Right? So this is potentially what is required. Right now, we need to see how India would, have those mandates coming in and so on. Right. The second question was, is there enough feedstock available in the country to meet this kind of requirements, right? Now, there are multiple pathways, Rishi, just to highlight, and I'll just focus on three of those main pathways. What is traditionally called or used today, and that's what most of the SAF in the world is produced, is HEFA route, and it uses used cooking oil or waste animal fat and so on, right? It's kind of oil you are using or fat you are using to convert into aviation fuel, a sustainable aviation fuel. That's the HEFA route. The second predominant route is what is called as alcohol to jet, that is ethanol to jet. And ethanol can come from your feed, the way we are doing ethanol blending program. It can come from sugarcane, molasses, grains like maize or broken rice and so on. Ethanol can also be produced from agri residue or agri waste or forest residues and so on, right? Which is a waste material in terms of plants, right? And third could be third generation ethanol. It's called as industrial off gases, and you can produce from them also ethanol. But ultimately, ethanol is produced and converted to alcohol to jet. As I said, you need to do a conversion process, right? And there are other methods, which is using Fischer Tropsch. You can use municipal solid waste, use the Fischer Tropsch process to convert into sustainable aviation fuel. Or you can directly capture carbon dioxide from air and use green hydrogen produced from green resources and again produced as synthetic fuel, right? So HEFA, alcohol to jet, or synthetic fuel. So broadly three different methods to produce, right? Now, when we look at India's, all of it, most of them is coming from sort of waste feedstock, right? Whether it's used cooking oil, whether it's agri residues or municipal solid waste and so on. These are all waste. There is one pathway, obviously, using sort of molasses and converting to ethanol and so on. And when we estimated and when we looked at different feedstocks in the country available, right, even in the waste, agri residue today, close to 230 million tons of is surplus agri residue. India produces more than 700 million tons of agri residue. It is used by farmers in some form and shape. But there is more than 230 million tons which is available, right? And even if we assume at 25-30% is converted, we would probably get 80 to 90 million tons of agri residue, which can be potentially used for converting SAF. And that will probably give us 7.5 to 8.5 million tons. And if you take other methods, right, partly coming from used cooking oil, and there are collection challenges. Each of the feedstocks has its own challenges today. But if we assume a certain number, if we are able to convert some of it, we estimated together at 8 to 10 million tons, right? Bulk of it coming from using part of agri residue, which is available in large quantities in the country. And as you mentioned earlier, there are feedstocks like sweet sorghum, which are in trial phases, and it's an interesting feedstock, right? It's a millet, it's a sorghum, but the plant grows very tall. So the stalk is more like a sugarcane kind of stuff. So you can use the stalk to produce ethanol. You can continue to use the millet. So it has dual roles. You are neither affecting the, not converting agricultural land to, produce fuel. You are using the same crop to produce millet, at the same time use the stalk to convert to ethanol. Right? So there are alternate feedstocks also available, which are in some form, trials in some places. There are people who are doing work on it, and hopefully it would add more to this 8 to 10 million tons. And we have not taken estimates on that because it's an early stage, right?
Again, we are also hearing that almost half a dozen more plants are in various R&D stages.
Correct. and multiple, right? There are tree oils, there are research, there is seaweed, there is research, and so on. So there are multiple other feedstocks available beyond what we have considered as in the report, because they are early stage, but as they mature, it will only increase the potential of producing uh, staff in the country.
So essentially, ways are there. The will has to be firmed up for the medium and long term, I guess.
Correct, correct.
So we are in the last part of the program, and I have two very important questions for you. One is, SAF, as you in the beginning you explained how agriculture can be a very intrinsic part of SAF. That was one. But you also said that India can become a global hub for manufacturing and exporting of SAF. Could you apprise our listeners about how can India leverage this opportunity? How can it become a manufacturing and exporting hub? While at the same time we have a large population to feed. So if we become a manufacturing exporting hub, that means more jobs, more revenues. How can this be achieved?
When we talked about earlier in the podcast, they said our requirements is close to 4.5 million tons, maybe potentially in 2050, right? At the same time, when you look at global SAF requirements, right, it's huge. It's close to 180 million tons by, different estimates, but, based on one of the estimates, it's close to 180 million tons. So it's huge in terms of opportunity, right? Because as I said, IATA and airlines have committed to net zero by 2050. They are mandatory starting from 2027, CORSIA mandates kicking for all the countries except for whatever exceptions are there, whether it's a landlocked country or least developed or island countries or nations, right? But majority of the countries, majority of the airlines are covered by it, right? Now, even today, the SAF production demand is high. It's less than 1% of the total, blending required today in terms of the overall aviation fuel. So it's an opportunity because there is globally also the production or there are plans, but current production is not there to meet the requirements of 2030 or even today's requirements. All the airlines have committed certain portion today in terms of blending as well, right? But 2030, most of the airlines have taken 5 to 10% blending requirements in their own way, right? And some countries have higher blending requirements in some of the European countries, right? So there is a huge demand. Now, how can India play? And when we looked at potential, we saw 8 to 10 million tons can be potentially targeted, where our requirements is only 4.5 potential million tons, right? So there's an opportunity to even export an equivalent amount of what we are consuming. And there are countries which are countries in the Middle East which are logistical hubs, right? So, however, India's advantage of these huge country with huge agricultural production and agricultural residue which is available, which is not used today. And therefore, we have that feedstock advantage. We are logistically closer to some of the markets, whether you take Singapore, whether you take Middle East, and there's a huge requirement in Europe, right? We are closer to those markets, especially Middle East and Singapore. So therefore, there is a logistics advantage. There is a feedstock advantage today the country has. And if you are able to channelize through right incentives and so on, we should be able to meet some of the requirements generating from these demand centers as well, to meet their requirements as they go on decarbonizing the aviation sector. So there are clear-cut advantages for India to meet some of the requirements by itself meeting our own requirements at the same time.
So we come to the last part, Prashant, and though you've been in your discussions, you have here and there did mention the challenges, but essentially, if we look at SAF and the aviation sector, what are the challenges that you see, and what do you think can be done, to address them?
So I think there are two key challenges, if I put in terms of the technology maturity in some of this is early stage, right? So when we talked about different pathways, HEFA is the most used. However, we don't have enough feedstock in that, cooking oil is, collection of used cooking oil becomes a challenge. The quality of used cooking oil becomes a challenge, especially in India when we are looking at HEFA route, right? When we are looking at alcohol to jet route, So the technology for converting ethanol or feedstock to ethanol is nascent. We have seen there are plants coming online. We have seen one of the plants of the major refinery in North India being operational, but it's early stage, right? So there is technology which is nascent in that state, right? So that barriers have to come out. Second is collection of the feedstock itself. While we said there is an opportunity, we need, robust collection mechanism, from different farms and farmers, etc. Right? The small and marginal farmers are the backbone of agriculture in this country. And therefore, we need systems and logistics infrastructure in place to collect from, it's a seasonal in that sense, right? So it needs to be collected during the particular period when this feedstock is available. Then it needs to be stored so that it's used during the year, right? So the logistics infra for feedstock collection and potentially incentives to collect and incentives to farmers to be given to make sure that there is incentives across the value chain to make it happen. As technology matures, I think the production cost will come down. Today, SAF production costs are higher. If I take an alcohol to jet, using different pathways, it will cost anywhere between 2.5 to 3.5 times. If I use the agri residue, it will be on the higher side of 3.5 times. So therefore, it's more expensive, right? So, but as technology matures, as scale of plants increases, this cost is likely to reduce. But in the initial years, therefore, there should be some form of incentive, some form of clear roadmap and pathways, which will help the investors and the companies to make those bets.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Prashanth. I think a much stouter, robust context to this developing biofuel couldn't have been made. Thank you so much, for, sparing time and, patiently breaking it down for us and our listeners. Thank you so much. Great to have you on the Business Line podcast.
Thank you. Thank you, Rishi. Thank you for giving us this opportunity. Thank you very much.